This episode was previously only available to patrons of the Morbid Curiosity podcast. We are making it available to everyone, so enjoy this episode and please consider becoming a patron. The lowest tier is only $2 a month. Thank you. This episode contains discussions of physical and sexual violence against women, murder, and detailed descriptions of bodily mutilation. If these aren't topics you want to hear about, this may be a good episode to skip. Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. Interest in these disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped millions of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. This is part 2 of the 100th episode of the Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you haven't listened to part 1, I recommend you go back and do that, as part 2 is mostly an analysis of the information from part 1. Part 3 will go into even more detail about the victims. This episode will be a summary of the evidence and the suspects. I'm no expert, and there is way more information than I can sort through with the time and effort I'm limited to. I will recommend several books throughout the episode that have a good grasp of the information if you want to know more. In part 1 of this episode, I discussed the East End and the Whitechapel murders, 5 of which were attributed to one killer, nicknamed Jack the Ripper. I mentioned that it was hard to police the area due to the dark, narrow streets, the densely packed population, and the lack of police constables. The people of the East End also didn't want to work with the police due to their reputation as being inept and corrupt. I also mentioned that after the first 5 Whitechapel murders, the police were chasing both real leads and hundreds of hoaxes. Over the years, numerous suspects have been put forward, including doctors, butchers, and even members of the royal family. However, the evidence against these suspects has often been circumstantial or speculative, and no one has been conclusively proven to be the Ripper. The official investigation conducted by the police at the time did result in several suspects being identified, but none of them were ever charged. The police files on the case have been made public, and many of the theories and suspects put forward over the years have been based on these documents. There is little physical evidence left from the Jack the Ripper case. The police did collect some evidence, such as the victim's clothing and body parts, but most of these have been lost, stolen, or destroyed over time. Also, the methods used to collect and preserve evidence in 1888 were not as advanced as they are today, which may have contributed to the loss or degradation of the evidence that was collected. The most well-known piece of physical evidence is a piece of a blood-stained shawl that was purportedly found near the body of Catherine Eddowes. The shawl is actually a piece of fabric found near her body at the crime scene. At the time, the police didn't think the piece of cloth was evidence, as it was unclear if it belonged to Eddowes. Years later, it was thought to be the evidence that could solve the case. Physical and chemical testing occurred in 1987, and the fabric was found to be a small part of something bigger, and traces of human blood and hair were found on it. In 2007, it was tested for DNA, but the results were inconclusive. Therefore, there is no confirmed physical evidence left over from the crime scenes. We do have some primary sources, that is, first-hand accounts from people who had a direct connection with the victims, investigation, or murders. These sources include police files, coroner inquest reports, crime scene photographs, and sketches produced by the police, personal accounts of the people involved in the investigation, and letters sent both by the police and possibly the killer. Unfortunately, many official files were either culled over time, stolen by later researchers, or lost during World War II in the London Blitz in 1940 and 1941. The Metropolitan Police and City of London files include witness statements, correspondence, and reports. The coroner's inquest reports for Tabram, Nichols, Chapman, Stride, Eddowes, and Kelly provide valuable information about the circumstances surrounding the murders. Though most of the original inquest records have been lost, the contemporary newspaper coverage by the Daily Telegraph and the Times was in-depth and very detailed. We do have the original post-mortem examination report on Mary Jane Kelly, written by Dr. Thomas Bond. The report was lost until 1987, when it was returned anonymously to Scotland Yard. Crime scene photographs and sketches from the time are also available. Post-mortem photographs of the victims' faces and one full body shot of Catherine Eddowes after her post-mortem were taken, both as documentation of injuries and for identification purposes. These were found in 1988 in an archived photo album that had been used for CID training. We also have one in-situ crime scene photo of the interior of 13 Miller's Court, which includes the mutilated body of Mary Jane Kelly. The photo wasn't found until the 1960s, when it was discovered amongst the collections at the Black Museum at New Scotland Yard. These photographs are now held in the National Archives in Kew, London. The Ripper letters, sent to the Central News Agency and passed on to police by Tom Bullen, a journalist, were covered briefly in Part 1, so I'll go over them in a bit more detail here. The first was the Dear Boss letter, dated September 25, 1888, and posted on the 27th. This was given to the police on the 29th by Bullen. Written in red ink, the writer jeered at the police's inability to capture him. He stated that he loved his work and gave the last lady, who was Chapman, no time to squeal. He claimed the next lady would have her ears clipped to show that he was the real killer. He asked for his letter to be kept from the press until the next death. It was signed Jack the Ripper, and the police received it hours before the double event occurred. The police received a postcard on October 1st, just after the double killing, now called the Saucy Jack postcard, as the killer described himself as such. The killer said he wasn't kidding about continuing his work, and that the police would hear about it tomorrow, threatening a double event this time. He claimed that one of the women squealed and he couldn't finish his work. He also claimed he hadn't had time to get the ears to the police, but thanked them for waiting to publish his last letter. A third letter arrived on October 5th. Instead of passing on the original, Bullen sent a transcript. In the letter, the killer claimed to only kill whores because if he killed any women other than whores, the power and protection granted him by God would quit. He threatened a triple event and said he'd send the police a bit of face. The From Hell letter, which included a portion of kidney, was received by George Lusk, head of the Mile End Vigilance Committee, on October 16, 1888. The killer said he took the kidney from Eddowes' body, ate part of it, and sent the other part to Lusk. At first, Lusk thought the letter was a poor joke from a bored anatomy student. Still, he took the kidney to the London hospital, and the museum curator, Dr. Thomas Openshaw, confirmed it was human. Lusk immediately gave the whole parcel to H Division of the Met Police. Handwriting analysis was performed on these letters. However, the results were inconclusive and caused debate amongst researchers. Also, some of the letters may have been tampered with over the years, adding to the difficulty. Some experts suggest that the handwriting in the Dear Boss letter and the Saucy Jack postcard is the same person. Others suggest that the Dear Boss letter handwriting matches that of Thomas Bullen. Similarly, the handwriting in the Saucy Jack postcard is suggested to match that of a local businessman named James Maybrick, a possible suspect in the Ripper case, who I'll get to later. The From Hell letter has also been subjected to handwriting analysis, with some experts suggesting that the handwriting matches that of Lusk himself, while others disagree. All of these suggestions are matters of debate, therefore the author remains unknown. The Ripper murders were extensively covered in the newspapers of the time, and these articles are considered primary sources, but it's important to note that many of the articles lack credibility due to sensationalism and embellishment. Therefore, I'm not going to go into them. As for personal accounts, we have a few in the form of autobiographies from some of the policemen involved in the case. In 1894, Sir Melvin Macnaghten, who was Chief Constable of the Criminal Investigation Department of Scotland Yard at the time, wrote a memorandum in response to a claim in the newspaper that a man named Thomas Cutbush was connected to the slayings. This short letter is one of the most quoted documents in Ripper investigations because, while it dismisses Cutbush, it names 3 other suspects. More on that in a moment. Another letter, sent September 23, 1913, to journalist George R. Sims by then Chief Inspector John Littlechild, suggests that Francis Tumblety was possibly Scotland Yard's #1 suspect, and discussed conflicting theories of the officers involved at the time of the murders. The letter also mentions that it was commonly believed by police authorities that the Ripper letters were written by journalist Thomas Bullen or his boss John Moore to aid newspaper circulation. Bullen had a lot of privilege with the police and occasionally sent strange and inappropriate headlines by telegram when drunk. There are numerous secondary sources on the Ripper murders. A secondary source is a resource that discusses a past event that the writer was not directly a part of. This includes books, scholarly articles, documentaries, websites, and podcasts about the murders. Again, not all sources are created equal in terms of reliability. There are also several photos of many of the locations where the bodies were found. These were taken years after the murders, but before the locations were demolished or changed. At the time, the police noted a pattern to the killings. Each one took place in either the first or last week of the month, usually on the weekends or a bank holiday. During the break in the murders in October, there was a very thick fog during the bank holiday, which may have prevented a murder that month. During the inquests, several witnesses testified to seeing the victims in the company of a mysterious man not long before they died. It's unknown if the same man was seen in each case. The descriptions vary, even between 2 witnesses describing the same man. I'll go through the available descriptions now, but keep in mind that witness testimony is not always reliable. Martha Tabram was last seen alive with a soldier, a private, by her friend Mary Ann Connolly, aka Pearly Poll. According to Connolly, the soldiers had white bands on their caps indicating Coldstream Guards. Tabram also had a wound that looked like a bayonet wound. This was evidence enough for the police to arrange a lineup of guards for Connolly to identify. However, she said with confidence that the 2 she and Tabram had been out with were not in the lineup, then chose 2 possible candidates who happened to have solid alibis. Police Constable William Smith may have seen Elizabeth Stride while walking his beat. Around 12:30 a.m., he saw a couple near the gate to Dutfield's yard, where Elizabeth Stride's body was found. However, he didn't approach the couple, seeing nothing suspicious. Later, he recognized Elizabeth Stride's corpse as the woman he'd seen. He described the man as being around 5'7", around 28 years old, with a small dark mustache, a dark deerstalker hat, dark clothes, and carrying a newspaper parcel that was about 18 inches long and 6 to 8 inches wide. Israel Schwartz also witnessed the couple about 10 minutes after P.C. Smith. He didn't speak English, so an interpreter was used to take his statement. As he passed the yard, Schwartz saw a man speaking to a woman standing in a gateway. The man tried to pull the woman into the street, throwing her down on the footpath. She screamed, but not loudly. On the opposite side of the street, a man smoking a pipe shouted Lipski, an anti-Jewish slur, then tried to follow Schwartz, who ran. Schwartz couldn't tell if the 2 men were associated. The violent man was about 5'5", around 30 years old, with fair hair, a small dark mustache, a full face, broad shoulders, a dark jacket and trousers, a black cap with a peak, and nothing in his hands. A man named Joseph Lawendy may have seen Catherine Eddowes with a man near the entrance to Meter Square at about 1:30 a.m. He couldn't see the woman's face, but the clothing he described matched what she was wearing that night. He described the man with her as around 30 years old. 5'7" to 5'8", with fair complexion, fair mustache, medium build, a pepper and salt loose jacket, gray cloth cap, and a red hanky around his neck. The man reminded him of a sailor. George Hutchinson, a friend of Mary Jane Kelly's, said he met her around 6 p.m. on Dorset Street. He saw her run into a man carrying a small parcel. They laughed loudly, and Hutchinson heard Kelly say, "All right." The man said, "You will be all right for what I've told you," and put his arm around her. He gave her a red hanky and a kiss, and she said, "All right, my dear, come along. You will be comfortable." As they walked past Hutchinson toward Kelly's home, the man tried to hide his face. The man was about 34 or 35, 5'6", with a pale complexion, dark eyes, a slight mustache that curled up at the ends, a long dark coat, dark trousers, a dark felt hat turned down in the middle, and black boots. Mary Jane Kelly's neighbor, Mary Ann Cox, saw Kelly around midnight with a man the night before her body was discovered. They were both quite drunk. Cox described the man as about 36, about 5'5" with a blotchy face, small side whiskers, a thick carroty mustache, and shabby dark clothes. Over 100 suspects have been accused of being the Ripper. Many theories are intriguing, while others are entertaining but far-fetched. What little evidence there is can eliminate some of the wilder theories, but there is no way to definitively prove or disprove most theories. I'm going to explore some of the theories, saving the most outlandish for last. First, most researchers believe that the Ripper was one person based on the similarities in the victims and the pattern of the killings. However, the theory that the murders were the work of more than one person has also been suggested. One of the arguments for this theory is that the murders showed a level of skill and organization that would have been difficult for a single person to pull off without being caught. Also, more than a few people have suggested that Elizabeth Stride may have been killed by someone else, as her death involved no mutilation and it occurred within an hour of Catherine Eddowes' murder. Second, the Ripper murders exacerbated popular suspicion of anatomists, which was already quite high due to public horror with dissections and the resurrectionist trade in human corpses. The divisional surgeons who performed post-mortem examinations of the Ripper victims were eager to differentiate their work from that of the Ripper. Therefore, the post-mortem photographs show the victim's face only, all cleaned up, looking as if they were asleep. The surgeons may also have emphasized the brutality and speed of the mutilations of the Ripper to further distance their own work from what the Ripper did. Still, the idea that the killer had some knowledge of anatomy has become an accepted theory, and many researchers take it as fact. Third, most researchers take it as fact that the killer was a man due to the strength required to make some of the cuts on the bodies, especially the deep throat wounds. The notion that the Ripper might not be a man was mentioned by Inspector Aberline at the time of the killings. According to Donald McCormick, author of The Identity of Jack the Ripper, published in 1959, Aberline raised the theory that the Ripper might be a woman in a conversation with his mentor, Dr. Thomas Dutton, after the murder of Mary Kelly. The testimony given by Caroline Maxwell was central to his theory. Maxwell, Kelly's neighbor, said she saw Kelly at the corner of Miller's Court between 8 and 8:30 a.m. on the day her body was discovered. She said they spoke, and that they saw and spoke to each other again at the Britannia pub around 9 a.m., and this time Kelly was with a man. This testimony flies in the face of all other testimony surrounding Kelly's murder, so it's hard to draw any firm conclusions. Some take this testimony as evidence that the killer was a woman, or perhaps a man, dressed as Mary Kelly to avoid suspicion, was seen and spoken to by Maxwell. However, this theory is feeble, as Maxwell would likely have recognized if it was Kelly or not. In 1890, Mary Piercy was executed after murdering her husband and child by deeply cutting their throats. The notion that a woman couldn't commit such a murder was dashed. This opened many new theories for the Ripper case, one of which is intriguing. There's a certain type of woman who could wander the streets covered in blood at any hour without looking suspicious and knew about female internal anatomy: midwives. Unfortunately, most theories that suggest a female was responsible are shot down, and the evidence does suggest the killer was more likely a man, but I believe a female killer should not be discounted. The police had several suspects in mind early in the case. Two that were accused in the midst of the murders were Joseph Eisenschmidt and Jack Pizer. Just after the murder of Annie Chapman, but before word had spread about it, a man with blood on his collar and hands got a drink at the Prince Albert pub in Whitechapel. The pub was not far from the location the body was found. Realizing this after the news spread, the owner, Mrs. Fiddemont, reported the man to the police. The bloodied man was later identified as Joseph Eisenschmidt, a butcher who had spent time in Colney Hatch Asylum. Since his release, he had been unsettled and was soon turned in by his estranged wife and landlord for acting suspiciously. When the police found him, he was sent to Fairfield Road Asylum in Bow due to his declining mental health. It was judged that he couldn't have committed the murders, as he was nearly catatonic. Another man, Jack Pizer, nicknamed Leather Apron, was brought in for questioning when rumors began to fly in Whitechapel that the killer was called Leather Apron. Pizer was a Jewish bootmaker with a criminal record who was known to police. However, he had solid alibis for the killings, and there was little concrete evidence linking him to them. In the autobiographies of Anderson, McNaughton, and some notes from Swanson, there are conflicting details about the Ripper case. However, there was one name that appeared in all three as a suspect. The name Kosminski was mentioned in the McNaughton memoranda that I mentioned earlier. At the time, Kosminski was often used to refer to any Jewish man, so the name was ignored for a while. Then the name appeared in a set of private annotations written by Donald S. Swanson, the head of Whitechapel murder investigations, in his personal copy of Assistant Commissioner Anderson's memoir, The Lighter Side of My Official Life, published in 1910. The notes appear next to a paragraph in which Anderson explains that the murderer was known and was a, quote, poor Polish Jew from Whitechapel, end quote, who was identified by a witness, but the witness refused to testify against him. Swanson wrote in pencil that the witness didn't want the suspect's death on his conscience. After the suspect was identified and known to police, the murders stopped. On an end page, Swanson continued, the suspect was identified at a seaside home where he had been sent with great difficulty by police. After being identified by police, he was sent back to his brother's home in Whitechapel, and the police kept watch on him day and night. Very quickly after returning to Whitechapel, the suspect was sent to Stepney Workhouse and then to Colney Hatch Asylum. He died shortly after entering the asylum. Quote, Kosminski was the suspect, end quote. This writing is known as the Swanson Marginalia and was revealed in 1987. The meaning of these notes has been debated for years. At the time, witnesses must testify or risk committing an offense themselves, so why was this witness allowed to stay silent? It's reasonable to assume the suspect was not of sound mind, as he was sent to an asylum, but this would have also made him ineligible for immediate prosecution and guaranteed life in an asylum instead of the death penalty. Again, if this was the case, why did the witness refuse to testify? Neil Bell, author of Capturing Jack the Ripper in the Boots of a Bobby in Victorian London, suggested that Anderson may have just been trying to assure the public that the case was closed, even though it never was officially, or that Swanson made a mistake. A mistake is unlikely given Swanson's experience. Perhaps he used a calculated choice of words to excuse the lack of conviction in the case. Still, the name Kosminski seemed to be the real name of a suspect, and it was mentioned by McNaughton, Swanson, and referred to by Anderson, warranting further investigation. It was later linked to Aaron Kosminski, an inmate of Colney Hatch Asylum from 1891. Kosminski was a Polish immigrant who was in the asylum for self-abuse after being taken from his brother's home to the Mile End Old Town Workhouse in 1890. There he was deemed to have been insane for 2 years. However, the similarities in the story end there. Kosminski died in 1919 in Leversden Asylum, and apart from threatening his sister with a knife, he was nonviolent. McNaughton also mentioned the names Druitt and Ostrog in his memoranda as potential suspects. Montague John Druitt was a barrister who was found dead in the River Thames about a month after Mary Jane Kelly was killed. It was suspected that he ended his own life. He had been dismissed from his job as a schoolmaster shortly before the murders began, which may have caused him to snap. His suicide shortly after the final murder led some to believe that he was trying to avoid arrest and punishment. Despite these circumstances, there is no direct evidence linking Druitt to the murders. Many researchers mistakenly state that Druitt was a physician, possibly because his initials are MD. Michael Ostrog was accused by McNaughton and Henry Smith of the city police. Ostrog was a Polish-born Russian conman and career criminal. He had a history of violence against women. However, he was in jail during the Ripper murders. The Littlechild letter mentions Francis Tumblety, a notorious quack doctor with a deep, well-known hatred for women. He often made derogatory comments about women and was prone to physically assault them. He was also in the East End at the time of the Whitechapel murders. Most disturbingly, he had a collection of female uteruses, which he kept in jars in his home. Tumblety was arrested on suspicion of the murders, but released due to a lack of evidence. Another suspect was Joseph Barnett, Mary Jane Kelly's boyfriend. He was suspected mainly due to his association with Kelly. They had lived together but separated not long before the murders. Also, Barnett made contradictory statements to police about his whereabouts on the night of the murder. However, no solid evidence has been found linking him to the crimes, and he was never officially named as a suspect by the police. There is more of a case for a physician named Thomas Neal Cream. Cream was convicted of poisoning 4 people and executed in 1892. He was in Whitechapel at the time of the Ripper murders, was a known sexual predator, and a killer of sex workers. Supposedly, he confessed to the murders while awaiting execution, so some believe that he may have committed the crimes. However, there is limited definitive evidence to support that Cream was the Ripper. His MO, or modus operandi, the preferred method of killing, was poisoning, not knifing and mutilation. Another poisoner who was suspected was George Chapman, a Polish-born barber who was convicted and executed in 1903 for killing his wives. Chapman, whose real name was Severin Klawowski, had a history of violence towards women, was in Whitechapel at the time of the murders, and had skill with a knife. Chapman also matched the vague physical description of Jack the Ripper that was given by some witnesses. He was about 5'6", slim, and had a mustache. However, all evidence against him was circumstantial, and his MO did not match that of the killers. One of the suspects accused long after the murders was James Maybrick, a wealthy cotton merchant who died in 1889. A diary that was discovered and claimed to belong to him contained confessions to the Ripper murders. However, the authenticity of the diary is widely disputed, with most researchers believing it to be a forgery. There is no other evidence linking Maybrick to the crimes. Another suspect named long after the murders was Walter Sickert, a British painter. Most of the case against Sickert is circumstantial at best and is mainly due to alleged similarities between his paintings and the murders. He lived in Whitechapel, often painted gruesome violence in his work, and often used aliases. In the 1990s, DNA tests were conducted on envelopes and stamps of several of the Ripper letters with hopes of matching it to Sickert's DNA. However, the results of the tests were inconclusive and did not link Sickert to the murders. One of the theories that caught my attention was suggested by historian Elizabeth Hurren in 2016. Dr. Hurren hypothesized that Jack the Ripper was a member of the London medical community who participated in the resurrectionist trade, where human corpses were traded for cash to medical schools for anatomical purposes. The theory is based on the idea that the killer had surgical skills and that he evaded capture through his connections with the medical community. Hurren suggests that the killer was acquiring sought-after female anatomical specimens. The value of these specimens and the body trade in general was enough for the medical community to cover up the murders to keep the supply coming. She also suggested that perhaps the murdered women had worked in the body trade and had outlasted their usefulness, or threatened to expose the trade somehow, and were therefore killed by another member of the body trade to keep them quiet. While this theory, like many others, is circumstantial, it's certainly interesting. One of the more recent suspects is Robert Mann, the mortuary keeper for the Whitechapel Workhouse, based on similarities between his appearance and the descriptions of the suspect. Mann actually worked on Nichols' corpse, undressing and washing it when specifically told not to. However, Mann was not a medical man, he was a laborer. He wasn't suspected at the time, and there is no evidence linking him to any of the other victims. Now, let's get into the most outlandish theory. In 1973, the Royal Conspiracy Theory emerged in a BBC program called Jack the Ripper, in which fictional detectives Barlow and Watt finally solve the Ripper mystery through a series of conspiracies and cover-ups. The story goes that the producers of the program, in doing research, were told to contact a man named Joseph Sickert, who knew about a secret marriage and pregnancy between Prince Albert Victor, grandson of Queen Victoria, and a poor Catholic girl named Annie Crook. Joseph's father, Walter Sickert, had introduced them. After the birth of their child, Queen Victoria charged Sir William Gull, the royal physician, to cover up the affair. Gull kidnapped and supposedly tried to erase Crook's memory of the events with medical experiments. The child, Alice, was hidden away in a convent by her nanny, Mary Jane Kelly, a good friend of Crook's. However, Kelly revealed the secret to some of her friends, Nichols, Stride, and Chapman. When they tried to blackmail the Queen with the information, Gull hired John Netley, a coachman, to carry out the murders. Together, they created the character Jack the Ripper and chose Montague J. Druitt as a scapegoat, while Sir Robert Anderson was paid to keep the police investigators at bay. Druitt was then killed to keep him quiet. Alice grew up and later married Walter Sickert and gave birth to Joseph. The program caused a sensation and led directly to the publication of Stephen Knight's controversial book, Jack the Ripper: The Final Solution, in 1978. In it, Knight tried to prove that the conspiracy was not only real, but that the third man in the murder triad was not Sir Robert Anderson, but Walter Sickert. This conspiracy theory, while entertaining, has been debunked by many ripperologists. There was never any hard evidence linking the prince to Annie Crook or even Walter Sickert. However, conspiracy theorists believe that the lack of evidence proves the theory, because all the evidence was destroyed. Regardless of its lack of legitimacy, the royal conspiracy remains one of the most popular theories, with several movies, novels, and graphic novels built around it. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains a mystery to this day. There is no one suspect who can be definitively proven to be the killer. Rumors, circumstance, and suspicion aren't enough to prove anything, but the process of trying is fascinating and has become an obsession for many, even 130 years after the murders. The mystery will likely never be solved. Perhaps this is why Jack the Ripper continues to spark our morbid curiosity. The Morbid Curiosity podcast is produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic, you can do so on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast or on our website, www.morbidcuriositypodcast.com. If you like the podcast, please share it with your friends and give us a rating on whatever podcast app you use. This helps the MCP reach new listeners and expand this wonderfully creepy community. Thank you to everyone who has already done so. Because of you, the listeners, our creepy community is growing strong. The MCP has joined the Straight Up Strange podcast network, which hosts true crime, paranormal, history, science, folklore, and other enigmatic podcasts. Nothing is off limits when you enter the world of Straight Up Strange. The MCP is also part of the Belfry Podcast Network, a haven for goth culture featuring podcasts, blogs, and videos, all catering to the darker side of life. If you'd like to support the MCP but would rather not become a patron, you can give one-time donations on our website and our Ko-fi page. Also on our website are links to all our social media, a full list of episodes, links to our merch, and our mailing list. We also have an Amazon wish list at bit.ly/morbidwishlist. That's bit.ly/morbidwishlist. Any purchases from this list are greatly appreciated. We are eternally grateful for your support. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thanks for listening.